Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Haunted Mansion. Now, the Haunted Mansion's history is rich and interesting, and there's a lot of stories to tell about the Haunted Mansion, so I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about that first. The Haunted Mansion has always held a special place for me. I don't know, there's something about the intrigue of it all. There's something about the mystery of it. What Walt Disney created here, or Walt Disney's team created here, at his behest, is really kind of intriguing. It really tells a story that's not really a cohesive story, but really does come together as something kind of fun and interesting and whimsical in a way. And the story begins many years before Disneyland opened, when Walt Disney was still thinking about the idea for a theme park and trying to come up with something that he wanted to do. He had Herb Ryman draw up some plans for him of what this mouse park might look like. And it was interesting because Ryman came up with one idea to have a section in the back with a spooky old house on a hill and a graveyard in front of it. Because if you're going to create a town, why not have a town that's got a spooky old house? And Walt didn't like the idea at first because he was building this beautiful park. Remember, Walt's idea was to think up something that was like clean and neat and always sort of modern. And to have a spooky old rundown house didn't really fit. But he still liked the idea conceptually. So he put Imagineer Ken Anderson on the team to actually start thinking through how could this be constructed? What could we do here? And Ken came up with a few ideas that he pitched to Walt, but Walt didn't like them apparently. He didn't like the way this was coming together. It was too spooky, too abstract, too something. And that's when Walt had occasion to go and visit the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. So it's in somewhat northern California. It's supposed to be this interesting house with all these hidden rooms and funny staircases and weird oddities about it. And Walt fell in love with the idea of creating something that was more whimsical like that. Something that kind of captured the imagination more and wasn't just about this crazy story. It was something that would be a little more family-friendly in a way. By now, it's 1961, and Walt decides to up the ante a little bit and starts adding more Imagineers, more designers to the team to start thinking about concepts and what they can do. So he's got all these different people that he's assigning, and they're working on different concepts and pitching them back to Walt. Walt loves it and decides to start producing promotional materials.
This is a little scale model now of the Disneyland area. You've seen this many times, but we haven't got the ghosts in there yet. But we're out collecting the ghosts. We're going to bring ghosts from all over the world, and we're making it very attractive to them, hoping, they'll want to come and stay at Disneyland, so we're putting in wall-to-wall cobwebs, and we guarantee them creaking doors and creaking floors.
He actually started to produce handbills and other things talking about what the Haunted Mansion was going to be. So everyone came up with ideas, and they kept pitching them to Walt. They drew diagrams, they built dioramas, they came up with some different things, but it hadn't come together before they were assigned to work on the 1964 World's Fair, because that's that moment when everything changed for Walt Disney. And so everyone moved to work on that project, and no one was working on some of the other things that were still hanging out there that hadn't started yet. But the Haunted Mansion was still a good idea. That World's Fair turned out to be another great moment, with the audio animatronic that was Mr. Lincoln, with the Ford exhibit that had the Mustang cars that were driving along. It became something of a moving vehicle that really captured Walt in a way, where he thought about, wait, what if we had you go through a haunted mansion? What if we had you go through some sort of house rather than walking through some sort of story place or a wax museum? Why not move you through it? So the idea started to develop a little more. Anderson had suggested that the house itself should look something like the Shipley Lydecker house in Baltimore, Maryland. This one had sort of an intriguing feel to it. It sort of looked mysterious, looked old, looked Victorian, kind of fit with the theme that they wanted. And so they were designing something that was similar in nature to that particular building. And when they started to think about where it would fit, with New Orleans Square coming along, why not make it a haunted old place in New Orleans Square? So that idea came to fruition. Mark Davis, Ex Atencio, and Claude Coates each got assigned to work on parts of the Haunted Mansion. Now, there was some discussion about whether it should be a spooky Haunted Mansion or whether it should be a truly whimsical Haunted Mansion. And what should the story be? Should it be of a bride who was jilted? Should it be of a woman who was left at the altar? Of someone who was killed? Of something that happened? What should be the storyline? And so they talked a lot about what that storyline would be. And you can read a lot about what their concepts were, what they were thinking, where they were going with it, because it's all very convoluted and nothing ever came to fruition exactly. Everyone had drawings and ideas and things that they wanted to do, but no one was really clear on which direction they wanted to go. A couple of the Imagineers, Raleigh Crump and Yale Gracie specifically, were playing around with a bunch of different ideas that were pop-up effects, spooky things that you would think of when you think of Halloween to a large degree. And they were working in one room in the studios, and they were doing some things, and they left a lot of things running, and the cleaning crew came in that night and was scared off by them. And there's kind of a funny little side story there, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's kind of a funny story that they got scared by these effects that were left on overnight. So Crump and Gracie knew they had something. And they had this idea to go more whimsical. And as the things started to develop, it became clear that they needed to make a little bit more story that would evoke some of the spookiness, but still keep it family friendly. Now, of course, as you know, Walt Disney died in 1966. And that slowed down production on this idea for a little bit longer. But it did pick up again shortly after that. And they decided to go ahead with the idea of creating something that was really kind of fun, interactive, and entertaining to kind of tell a story about a bride who was jilted, but not a complete story. So as you ride through the Haunted Mansion, you realize that there's not a complete story being told. It's most of a story. It's part of a story. There's some story elements there. But what happened was all of these different story elements got kind of mushed together into a singular story to talk about ghosts and haunted mansions and things like that. It sort of missed the mark in terms of telling a complete story, but it's so well done and it's so technically advanced that it's really, really interesting and it works anyway. So Paul Frees was hired as the voice of the Haunted Mansion, and he was going to be your ghost host, taking you on the tour through the supernatural. Paul Frees was a natural at doing this, at putting something together that really did work. It came together, and his voice really did command some authority in the whole thing. He had enough whimsy in his voice and enough the way he talked and the way he carried himself. It came alive to a large degree. Ha ha ha, pun intended. Now, there was still one other problem, and it's kind of a simple problem to solve. There was still a hook missing. They needed a song. They needed something that was going to come together and really sell the Haunted Mansion as something. What they found was when they created the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Yo-Ho song was really the thing that carried forward and made the whole thing tie together and play it throughout the entirety of Pirates of the Caribbean. Like the Haunted Mansion, the Pirates of the Caribbean has no specific story. It's a bunch of story elements that come together. So they needed something like that in the Haunted Mansion. Ex Atencio, with George Bruns, wrote the Pirates of the Caribbean song. Here he was working with Buddy Baker. Buddy Baker is another legend in the world of Disney, another studio artist who wrote a number of the tunes that you're aware of. And he and Buddy sat down and wrote Grim Grinning Ghosts, a song that's sort of whimsical, talking about the ghosts that are in the Haunted Mansion, about spookiness, about something fun. But when you listen to the words, it's actually kind of comical to a large degree. It's the way they use the words and the way they put it together that actually works. And that song is repeated throughout the Haunted Mansion. It's in different forms, it's in different instrumentals, it's in the singing version, it's in different people kind of presenting it, but it's the same song over and over again. Sometimes it's with an organ, sometimes it's with a flute that's actually recorded and played backwards, sometimes it's with other instruments. But in doing so, you've created this song that ties it all together, and everyone knows Grim Grinning Ghosts. So it was kind of neat the way they were able to bring something together that really worked and draw it together to build a pretty cool story for the Haunted Mansion without having a story, right? It just ties it all together. It actually works that way. And one other detail about the music. Thurl Ravenscroft is the most familiar voice you'll hear throughout the attraction when you're thinking about the music. He was the voice of Tony the Tiger, and he appears here on the right with his group, the Mellow Men, who recorded a version of the Grim Grinning Ghosts, and that version is heard when the singing busts appear in the ride. Now, one of the problems they had is in Disneyland. It's very constrained, if you look at the map, by the area that it's in. Anaheim came up around it. It used to be all orange groves, but then there was all this housing and other development that came up. So they were very constrained in what they could do. Where they had the space for it, they didn't have enough space to have a show building. So the show building is really where all of the attraction takes place. That facade where you see the building up on the hill, that's just a facade. It's just an entryway to get you into the show building. The show building is kind of behind the scenes. You don't see it. It's a large warehouse type building where they have the track and everything runs around through there. There's what they call a berm on the backside of where you see the building that is the Haunted Mansion. And that berm is actually a roadway that they couldn't cross to get into the show building. So what they actually had to do was have you go in an elevator down under the ground, and then you walk through a tunnel. So the way to accomplish that was this thing they called the stretching room, where you would actually be in an elevator going down so you could get into the show building. It was a really smart way for them to accommodate the fact that they had this berm there and they couldn't get through it. So when they recreated this in Disney World, it's almost, I'd say probably about 95% a replica of what they had in Disneyland. There are some things that are different, certainly, but in general, it's the same attraction. They didn't want to lose sight of this idea of the stretching room because that was an important and integral part of the entirety of the show, the attraction. So they decided to build the stretching room at Disney World, but instead of you going down in an elevator, they just lift the roof up so that it has the same effect on you. When you look at it, it looks the same, but it's actually you're staying on the same level. And you can just walk straight through to the load area. But they wanted to keep that mystique alive and keep it the same. So that's what they did. They built it that way. One of the more interesting things to see at Disneyland and Walt Disney World is in front of the Haunted Mansion as you're entering the building, there's a graveyard. And in that graveyard are a number of the Imagineers commemorated in different ways, with sort of silly, fun phrases on their tombstones. So of course you'll find them for Mark Davis, Ex Atencio, Claude Coates, and Yale Gracie. Those are obvious. You know who they are based on what we've talked about. Raleigh Crump actually exists on a different sort of tombstone. He's in the mausoleum section at the end. And I believe in Disneyland, he has his own mausoleum that's a little bit different. Now, there are other people there as well. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. Now, Ken Anderson is also commemorated at one of the mausoleum spaces at the end. You have Leota Tombs, of course. She has the largest tombstone. It's the one right by the entrance. It's the one where the eyes light up and move around a little bit. Leota is Madame Leota. She's the woman in the seance room. There's also Fred Yorger, who was a model builder for Disney theme parks. And you have Bob Sewell, and he was a model artist also. Bud Martin helped Walt with the development of Disneyland, and he developed the master plan for the Magic Kingdom at Disney World. Cliff Hewitt was an architect who worked on much of the design of the Haunted Mansion. Walthall Rogers, this man was the genius behind the audio animatronics that we know today. Chuck Mayall was an art director who worked on the Haunted Mansion. Gordon Williams worked on the sound effects of the Haunted Mansion, so he was an audio engineer kind of guy. Dave Burkhart was an artist and model maker. Harriet Burns was the first female Imagineer at WED Enterprises. Blaine Gibson, who was a sculptor for Disney. And there are two other people who are commemorated here. The first is Paul Frees, who's your ghost host. And then there's Thurl Ravenscroft. He's commemorated with a name on the organ. Now, there is one other tombstone that's for Phineas Pock. In the graveyard scene, the 5 singing busts all have names. There's Rollo Rumpkin, Uncle Theodore, Cousin Algernon, Ned Nubb, and Phineas P. Pock. And I know, I've missed some names and I've missed some people, and my apologies to them and their legacy. I don't mean to leave anyone out. I was trying to call out the biggest names who were the biggest contributors to the Haunted Mansion. As you look around and you look at the other tombstones that are there, think about who they are and who they might have been and what they might have contributed. You can always Google them too. Now what I wanted to do is take a few minutes and take you through the attraction and talk about some of the cool special effects that they've built in here and how they do some of them. In one of the first rooms, you have the paintings that change when they're hit by lightning. And this is actually just a very simple visual effect that they do with lighting and a rear screen projection where they're actually able to change the image. It used to be that this was a one where the eyes followed you, and the eyes would follow you because they had hollowed out the eyes in the original painting and put an eyeball about 1/4 of an inch deep behind the painting so that it looked like that eyeball was following you. Very, very cool effect, very low cost, very highly effective. It's an old magician's trick, and it's very simple. When you go into the next room and you see the marble busts, and the faces on the busts follow you as you're going along. This is a really cool effect that's actually done with a mask that's turned backwards, so you're seeing the inside of the mask instead of the outside of the mask. So I've got an example here where I play around with it a little bit. I've got my own mask that I built, and you can see that I put it inside a black background behind. And you can see that I'm showing the inside of the mask where you're looking at it here. And what I do is I actually look at it that way. And when you walk along in front of it, you can see that it actually looks like it's looking at you. Now, what I did here is I actually created one, and I put a light in behind it, for Halloween especially, and I leave it outside, and people walk by it, and it looks like it's glowing and looking at you. It looks exactly like the masks they have in the Haunted Mansion. It's a very convincing effect. A marble bust that's actually moving and looking at you. Now, a couple of other effects that they have within the show. There's a couple of times that they use shadows. They're using an overhead light with something in front of it that's moving, that's articulating in front of it and creating a deep shadow below. The audio animatronics that you see in the haunted graveyard, they're really just animatronics that are painted in fluorescent colors and they're shining a black light on them. And they put a little bit of fabric in front of them so that it has a little bit more of an ethereal look to it. And then, of course, you have the talking or singing heads, busts, whatever you want to call them. They're the heads that are talking. So you have the Madame Leota in the seance room who's talking to you and doing different things. And then, of course, you have the singing busts in the graveyard that are singing Grim Grinning Ghosts, including Thurl Ravenscroft. So when you see this effect, this is actually simpler than you think it is. What they've done is they've taken a styrofoam head, and they put the styrofoam head with other things around it, and they project an image onto that styrofoam head. It's just a two-dimensional image that they project onto the styrofoam head. It's got the right dimensioning on it, but when you see it, it actually comes to life and looks like it's moving, as in this example. Again, another very simple but very convincing effect. Another effect that they use significantly is the one that they have in the ghostly ballroom, where all of these characters are doing different things, and it looks like they're ghosts. You can see right through them. As you look at it, it's an amazing effect. It really does look like they're ghosts, and where did they come from? And this is actually done very simply. There are audio animatronics below you and audio animatronics above you, and there's a plexiglass screen that's kind of in front of them that's reflecting their image back to you. So you're essentially looking at the image of them. They'll light up, so the audio animatronics are underneath you. They'll light them up. They're painted in fluorescent colors and whatever, and they'll reflect onto the plexiglass that's in front of you at an angle, and you'll be able to look through them but see them right there. So I actually was playing around with that a little bit here when I grabbed my just a soccer trophy, just a very simple example here. I grabbed a trophy that I had sitting there, and I have a little piece of plexiglass I'm playing around with, and I can look right through it. It's the same exact thing that they're doing there in the Haunted Mansion. One of the coolest things, so smart. It's called Pepper's Ghost. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention. Disneyland, DisneyWorld, and Tokyo Disneyland are very similar in their attraction. They're all pretty much the same attraction. It's the same thing. You go through, the story doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's so well done you don't care. But you go through it and you kind of see it come together. Phantom Manor in Disneyland Paris is a whole other story. They wrote a story that's much more detailed and sophisticated. The company hired Vincent Price, who is probably best known in the genre of horror films of the 1950s, to tell a story. And he really does have the voice for doing that. So they hired him to do part of the voice work, and they translated it into French and have someone else telling the story in French as well. But hearing Vincent Price in that really does give it that eerie, spooky feel. He's the perfect person to have be your ghost host to a large degree. And he tells a story that's a little more sophisticated. The bride died. They lived in an old mining town. Some things happened. It's kind of this crazy thing. But when you reach the graveyard scene at the end, it all kind of comes together because you're seeing this spooky graveyard that's part of an old mining town. And there's this guy who's the undertaker, I guess, and he's really beckoning people to come in and join him. And it's crazy. And it is kind of creepy, and it is kind of macabre. And it does kind of make the whole thing come together in a very different way than what you think of. And it's thought through a little more thoroughly. And for its part, Mystic Manor that appears in Hong Kong Disneyland takes this even further. Now, to be sure, it's odd. It's more Chinese in nature. It has a more whimsical approach to things. It's sort of a lighthearted fantasy-based theme that kind of flows through the storyline. It doesn't actually talk about departed spirits, ghosts, anything like that. But that's because of the Chinese culture and what they think of in the afterlife. So it's sort of a different thing as far as that goes. But it is the equivalent of the Haunted Mansion.